Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So today we want to continue with our discussion of the Ricardian model. So just to review very quickly what we did on Tuesday, you recall in our numerical example for Portugal, we had the following situation. The unit labor requirement in wine was 2. The unit labor requirement in cloth was 1, and Portugal had 3,000 workers. We found that the opportunity cost of producing additional cloth was 1/2, which also meant that the relative price of producing cloth was 1/2. And we saw that wages had to be the same in both industries if, in fact, if Portugal wanted to both produce and consume some of both goods. So we ended up, if I remember right, with $10 in each industry, if I remember right, for Portugal. And this is what their country diagram looked like. So remember, our production possibilities frontier is a straight line because of our assumption that labor productivity or unit labor cost requirements were constant. We face that with a country indifference curve. So we now know what the country can produce. That also generates its income. And then we want to maximize our level of economic welfare subject to our income constraint. So we want to find the point of tangency between the country indifference curve and the production possibilities frontier at point A. So that'll give us equilibrium in autarky. And notice that at that particular point, the demand for cloth and the supply of cloth will be the same, and the demand and the supply of wine will be the same. So we have equilibrium in both markets in Portugal, actually all 3 markets, the market for cloth, the market for wine, and the market for workers, and everybody's hunky-dory. In England, the situation was a little bit different. The unit labor requirement in wine was 3, where in the cloth industry it was 6, and England had a larger workforce at 6,000. We calculated here that the opportunity cost of producing cloth was 2, which also gave us the relative prices, and we also know to produce some of both goods, we would have to have wages in both industries being the same. And again, my recollection is the numbers we used said it was $3.33 an hour. So here's England's autarky situation. Again, very similar to what we saw with Portugal, although the slope of the production possibilities frontier is different, much steeper here, because it reflects a much higher opportunity cost of producing cloth in England than was the case in Portugal. So that allowed us then to look at the relative supply and relative demand curves in the 2 countries. So what we saw, again, because of our assumption that we have constant labor productivity, our supply curves will be horizontal. And they'll be horizontal at what the opportunity cost of producing cloth will be. So England has a relatively high relative supply curve for cloth versus Portugal's, which is relatively low. Because of our assumption that demand is homothetic, then the relative demand curves for both countries look exactly the same. So we end up with just having to draw one relative demand curve. Notice that because of that, and because England has a high relative price of cloth, they actually consume a relatively low quantity of cloth, where Portugal, with a low relative price for cloth, actually consumes a high relative quantity of cloth. So notice what makes a difference in terms of what these 2 countries are producing and consuming, the relative supplies, is the relative price. So everything here is being driven by the relative price. So this gives us our starting conditions. This is our autarky situation. So now what we want to think about is what's going to happen when we open up the international trade. That's what we want to figure out. Before we go there, however, we want to think about some concepts that we need to define very clearly here. The first is the notion of absolute advantage, absolute advantage. And in this particular example, Portugal has an absolute advantage over England in the production of both cloth and in the production of wine. So we can see that because our unit labor requirements, remember now, unit labor requirements is the inverse of the marginal product of labor. The unit labor requirement in cloth is higher in England than it is in Portugal, and the unit labor requirement in wine is also higher in England than it is in Portugal. So our actual numbers was that it only took 1 worker in Portugal to produce 1 unit of cloth, but 6 in England, where in the wine industry it took 2 workers in Portugal, but it took 3 workers in England. So Portugal has an absolute advantage in the production of both goods. Now recall something that I had said earlier. Adam Smith, when he wrote The Wealth of Nations, actually argued that a country will only gain from international trade if in fact it has an absolute advantage in the production of goods. So if you were to believe Adam Smith and you were England with an absolute disadvantage in the production of both of these goods, there would be no way to gain from international trade. Okay? What David Ricardo did, however, coming along several decades later, was to recalculate this whole notion of who gains and who loses and how by looking not at absolute advantage, but rather at comparative advantage. And when we look at comparative advantage, essentially what we can look at is the opportunity cost of producing goods and services. So in David Ricardo's setup, what we would end up saying is the opportunity cost of producing cloth is less in Portugal than the opportunity cost of producing cloth in England. So again, if we thought about what our numbers were, this was 1/2, and this was 6/3, 6/3, which is 2. Either way, whatever it is, it's still 1/2 is less than it, right? Okay, so again, we can see the opportunity cost of producing cloth in England is much lower than the opportunity cost of producing cloth in England. So, by the way, we would be able to tell that by looking at where the relative prices were. Remember, in autarky, the relative prices equal the opportunity cost. So just knowing the relative prices is going to tell us, in autarky, is going to tell us something about which country has a comparative advantage. Also notice that if we go back to our autarky diagrams, remember the opportunity cost is the slope of the production possibilities frontier. So right away, what we can see is for Portugal, they have a much flatter production possibilities frontier. Another way that we say that is that the production possibilities frontier is biased in the direction of cloth. Any production possibilities frontier that is biased in the direction of one good is a good that country will have a comparative advantage in. So just the shape of the production possibilities frontier gives us a lot of information about what good that country has a comparative advantage in. We could also talk about comparative advantage, not by looking directly at the opportunity costs, but rather looking at the relative productivities in the same industry, but across countries. So here we could look at what's the unit labor requirement in cloth in Portugal versus England, and compare that to the unit labor requirements in the wine industry, Portugal to England. And in this case, we would see 1 out of 6, of course, is less than 2 out of 3. So again, what we can see here is that Portugal is relatively, now remember, they have an absolute advantage in both industries, but they're much better at producing cloth compared to England than they are wine. They're only a little bit better in terms of wine production, but they're a lot better in terms of cloth production. And so it's that relative productivities that we can look at as well. So if Portugal has a comparative advantage in cloth, it will also turn out that England will have a comparative advantage in the production of wine. So again, if we were to look at the opportunity cost of producing wine, not cloth, but wine, between England and Portugal, we would see that the opportunity cost of producing wine in, I'm sorry, that's not right, is it? Is that right? It was 3/6, right? The opportunity cost of producing wine in England is 1/2, where the opportunity cost of producing wine in Portugal was 2. It will always be the case in a two-country, two-good model that if one country has a comparative advantage in the production of one good, the other country must have a comparative advantage in the production of the other good.
So if there were 2 countries and both countries were biased towards the same good, then they would be.
They won't both be biased to the same amount, unless they're identically, unless the unit labor requirements. So the question was, suppose we had 2 countries whose production possibilities curves were biased towards cloth, say. Looks sort of like what the Portugal one did. So does that mean that both of them have a comparative advantage in the production of cloth? And the answer is no. So when we're talking about biases, again, we're talking about relative biases. As long as the unit labor requirements are different between the countries, the slopes of the production possibilities frontiers will also be different. So we want to look at the relative bias, which one has the greater bias than the other one, the other country does. Okay. Okay, any questions on absolute or comparative advantage? Hopefully that's just a brief review from Micro. Okay, one other thing to just point out real quickly. Absolute advantage only requires the comparison of 2 unit labor requirements. Only 2. But when we talk about comparative advantage, we need all 4 unit labor requirements. So it's just not what's happening here in this industry versus there in the same industry. We have to know both industries, what our levels of productivity or unit labor requirements are in both industries in our country and in both industries in the foreign country. So comparative advantage requires a lot more information. Now you might think, how did David Ricardo figure this out? Adam Smith was a pretty bright guy, but Adam Smith was an academic. David Ricardo was actually a merchant. He was in the import-export business. So having some notion about relative productivities gave him some, between countries, gave him insight into the underlying factors that were important for what got imported and exported. Okay, now what we need to do with this information in hand is to think about how we want to analyze trade between Portugal and England. And to do this, we're going to construct a world relative supply curve and a world relative demand curve. So it's now we're going to be looking at what both countries will do in terms of production and consumption. So our world relative supply curve is going to be the quantity of cloth produced in both countries divided by the quantity of wine produced in both countries. So again, if you go back and you look at the autarky diagram, I think I put it in right. I'm not sure I did. We're just talking about the quantity of cloth versus the quantity of wine in each country. But now we want to think about it in both countries. And we want to look at that relative to or compared to the relative price of cloth. So in order to do this exercise, what we need to think about then is what are our production decisions? What are the production decisions in England? What are the production decisions in Portugal? When will we produce cloth? When will we produce wine? When are we indifferent and will produce both? Well, the production decisions are actually fairly straightforward. We went through this last time in autarky, and they're still the same production decisions. Whenever the relative price of a product is greater than its opportunity cost, you will only produce that product. If you can get more for something than what it costs you to produce it, that's what you're going to produce. If, for instance, the relative price of cloth was greater than the opportunity cost, you will only produce cloth. If it's less than the opportunity cost, you will only produce wine. And it's only when they're equal that you will produce both goods. So keep those production decisions in mind, because this is the world relative supply curve. Okay? So again, notice on our horizontal axis, we've got the total production of both countries in cloth divided by the total production of both countries of wine. On the vertical axis, we've got the relative price of cloth. And I've already put in the relative autarky prices in Portugal and England. So the first thing that we want to think about is, see if I can do this real clearly. Suppose that the relative price of cloth is less than the opportunity cost of producing cloth in Portugal. Whoops, that should be a C. Okay. So what we're talking about is, suppose we're below 1/2. Suppose we're down in this range for our relative price. What will the production decision in Portugal be? Produce cloth, produce wine, produce both. Wine? Cloth? Wine. Okay? So remember, our production decision, when the relative price is greater than the opportunity cost, then we'll produce that good. In this case, we're less than that. So here, the only thing that we're going to produce is wine. So at any price less than 1/2, our relative supply curve is going to be vertical. At 0, there'll be no cloth. We're only producing wine. Now, let's suppose that, now, I do mean for this to be 3, by the way, so if you're wondering. Let's suppose that the relative price of cloth is between the opportunity cost of producing cloth in Portugal and England. In other words, now what we're doing is we're above a half, but we're below 2. We're in that range. So now what's our production decisions? What are the production decisions? What does Portugal do? Only produces cloth. And what does England do? Only produces wine, right? So we've got the opportunity cost of producing, we have the relative price of cloth above the opportunity cost of producing cloth in Portugal, just produce cloth, and in England, the relative price is still below the opportunity cost. So we want to continue to produce wine. So now notice that Q star C will be 0, and QW will also be 0. So then we want to ask, what's the maximum amount of cloth that Portugal can produce? Now, you may remember from the numbers that we used before, but more generally, it will be the size of the Portuguese labor force divided by the unit labor requirements in cloth. So that's the maximum amount of cloth that Portugal can produce. Now, this is relative. We also need to think about what England is producing. Bless you. And the only thing they're producing is wine. The maximum amount of wine that they can produce would be the size of their labor force divided by the unit labor requirement that they have in the wine industry. So we can figure out what that ratio is, knowing the size of the labor force and the unit labor requirements. So what does this section of our relative supply curve look like? So notice that at every price above 1/2, Portugal will only be producing cloth, and England will only be producing wine. So what we have then is a vertical section of our world relative supply curve. Okay? So this will come down to just above 1/2 and go up to just below 2. So now, it's easy kind of to fill in the rest. Let's suppose that the relative price of cloth is exactly equal to the opportunity cost of producing cloth in Portugal, which of course we know is less than the opportunity cost of producing cloth in England. So now basically what we're saying, let's suppose the relative price is exactly 1/2. So what will England's production decision be? Produce only wine, right? So the relative price of cloth is still below the opportunity cost of producing cloth in England, so they're only going to produce wine. How about for Portugal? Now, Portugal is indifferent, right? They're going to produce some combination of both wine and cloth, depending upon what demand conditions in the country are. So when we have number 2, we actually have a horizontal section of our world relative supply curve at the level of 1/2. Okay. So now we've got 3 sections. We can also think about the 4th section. What happens if the relative price of cloth is above the opportunity cost of producing cloth in England? I'm sorry, I don't want to make that, let's make that equal. Which of course means that it's above the opportunity cost of producing cloth in Portugal. Okay. In other words, we're now saying, suppose that the relative price is 2. So what is Portugal's production decision? Produce only cloth. And what's England's production decision? Produce both, depending upon demand conditions. So again, we end up with another horizontal section of our world relative supply curve. Now notice that this actually just goes out forever because the cloth production goes up, the wine production goes down, the numbers get very, very large. So this then is our world relative supply curve. I'll give it a subscript of W for world. That's an R. Okay. Knew I shouldn't have that last cup of coffee. So we've got a world relative supply curve here. So notice that in this particular situation, the way that we set it up, and primarily because of our assumption of constant labor productivity, we end up with a step function, where at very low relative prices, everybody's producing only one good. Unlikely we're going to be there. Remember, we call these goods, not bad, so we presumably want to consume some of both goods. So then we have this horizontal section where the country with the lowest opportunity cost or relative price will produce according to demand. Then a vertical section where one country is specialized completely in cloth production and the other country is specialized completely in wine production. And then finally, the final section, number 4, where one country is still only producing cloth, but the other country is actually producing both goods. Okay. So are there any questions on how we derive this world relative supply curve? Okay, well, supply curves are fun, but let's also think about the world relative demand curve.